Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 72, Modern Philosophy, and this is week 9 for us, so the beginning of the last, third and final, right, part of the class, the last 4 weeks. So remember that we started the semester, right, the class has a theme, right, the self, the other, and the world, right. We began with Descartes. Before actually we got into Descartes, that was week 2, but we read a few pages when we were still in the face-to-face situation. A few pages from Gramsci, right? Antonio Gramsci, the prison notebooks on the study of philosophy, and then also we did the exercise we did with the painting by René Magritte, right? This is not a pipe. Then we started with Descartes, the establishing by Descartes of the self, the centrality of the self, the I think, right? I think, therefore I am, right? The cogito, and so on. And then we did Leibniz, very important philosopher, right? And the question of the individual substance, right, and the notion of an individual substance, and the question of contingency, which comes back today. Okay, keep that in mind. And then we moved to part 2 of the class, Spinoza and Nietzsche. We had two classes on Spinoza, right? In the first week, we focused on part 1 of the ethics, and then in the second week, week 6, on part 4 of the ethics. Then we did Nietzsche. Again, two classes on Nietzsche. One was based on, that was week 7, on the genealogy of morality or of morals, and the second one, week 8, last week, was based on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Okay, so we are doing today Kierkegaard. This is the section that begins part 3 of the class. Okay, we do Kierkegaard, then next time Sartre, and then Heidegger, two classes on Heidegger. Kierkegaard, this is the book, right, that we are reading from. We are reading selections from Kierkegaard, The Sickness Unto Death. And what I want to say, first of all, is that Kierkegaard is, a philosopher of the 19th century who comes a little before Nietzsche, right? He comes in the first part of the 19th century, right? Dies very young, and then Nietzsche in the second part of the 19th century, as I said probably last time. Time before that, Nietzsche dies exactly in the year 1900, right? So in any case, we did Nietzsche before Kierkegaard, because I wanted to do Nietzsche right after Spinoza, and then now we do Kierkegaard, and then next time Sartre, and I begin that way because Sartre, of course, is at least initially in the tradition of existentialism, right? The philosophy that places existence, as the most right fundamental concept, moment, and the existentialist movement that then comes about in the 20th century, around the time of World War II. Sartre is one of the philosophers of the existentialist movement, but the movement itself goes back to people like Kierkegaard, that we are doing today, and Nietzsche, and even others. Okay, but again, I can't be too long, so I just want to say a few words about this. Right? They say basically Kierkegaard is a forerunner of the existentialist type of thinking, philosophy movement. Although, of course, Kierkegaard never called himself an existentialist, there wasn't such a movement, when he was writing. But in any case, he wrote a lot, and again, we can't, because there are some very important moments that I want to highlight in this important book, right? A great book, The Sickness Unto Death. But let me say a few more words about existentialism. Existence, right? Traditionally, and we have seen that probably when we did Descartes, Leibniz, right? I mean, we always traditionally in philosophy there is this question of the relationship between existence and essence, and coming from also the tradition of Plato, and the dominant tradition really in philosophy usually looks at essence as more, fundamental, or as more original, if you will, more than existence, right? Essence names the whatness, and we spoke about that, or something. We spoke about that when we did Descartes, and existence, that T-H-A-T, thatness of something, right? Or thisness, but thatness, okay? And we saw that with Descartes, if you remember in Meditation 2, when Descartes says, well, now that I know that I am, then I had to find out what I am, and so on and so forth. Essence and existence usually, we are told, coincide, and that's what Spinoza also says, in God, right? In Spinoza, God is nature, in any case, one substance, but it is there that, and Descartes says the same, you cannot think of the idea of God and not thinking of God as existing as well, right? The essence and the existence of God uh, must, come together, coincide, okay? So in any case, there is, to be, again, I had to be sketchy about this. The idea is that, again, in Plato, for example, the most important ontological, word, we spoke about this word at the beginning of the class, element, reality, is precisely the idea, the form, right, the universal, right? I mean, the whatness of something. And then you have, in the material, sensible plane of reality world, right? Then you had existence of many, instances, right? For example, the chair, what it is to be a chair, what it is to be a chair, the idea of the chair, the form of the chair. That's in Plato, in ancient philosophy. Chairness, the chair as such, the chair itself, and so on and so forth. That's the whatness, the what, that's the idea, the essence that doesn't change, right? That's what essence ultimately is. And then you had the existence of many, many chairs, right? That are made, destroyed, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's the relationship, right? Between, I hope this is clear, essence and existence, right? But with the existentialist tradition, and we will see this also next time with Sartre, there is a reversal of this relationship, right? I mean, existence comes, especially in the human context, on the human plane, existence before essence. Essence comes only at the end. We will see this with Sartre next time. But in any case, what I want to say about existence is that the word ex, right, ex, this prefix often, right, means precisely outside, out, right, like in words like external, exit, and so on and so forth, right? And then the other part of the word means to stand, right? Stand, to be, to stand, right? So to exist is in the tradition of existentialism, to exist. Again, you can contact me with questions. I hope this is clear. You can Google that as well. To exist is to stand out. Okay, existence is standing out. Okay, the opposite of to exist would be to insist, to keep, being in the same place over and over again without moving, without doing anything, right? So that's the opposite, right? So we might say that the table, right there, is not going to do anything, right? There is no agency whatsoever. There is no existence in the sense of standing out. It's going to be there, standing in, all the time. Unless I move it, the table will be there. Whereas I can move about. I can do things. I can change precisely my situation, right? And this is what we will see. Keep this in mind, because again, it will come back very importantly. This question is very important. The question that we will see in Kierkegaard, this infinitizing moment, right? I can exit precisely, right, by standing out, by existing. I exit the frame, if you will, the situation in which I find myself. Think about that. We always find ourselves in a situation. The situation is given precisely by the here and now to begin with. There are other elements and so on and so forth, but certainly I'm always here now. I'm always somewhere at some point in time, right? That's my situation, but that doesn't have to be my situation forever. I can change it, right? I can, as one might say, push the limits and change things, and I can exit the box in which I find myself, the frame, right? Because the situation is always like, think about a square, right? A box, it's always a framing. We are always framed somehow, right? And but we cannot change that situation. So the situation in which we find ourselves, and certainly to begin with, think about the beginning of one's life, right? A situation, we find ourselves there in that family, that community, that country, that language, that religion, and so on and so forth. All this is not of our choosing. We simply find ourselves there. We had done nothing to be there, and it's not of our choosing. But then, starting from that moment, and increasingly so, we can change the situation. I can stop speaking the language that I was brought in, and that I was raised in. I can and speak learn another language and speak that language only. I can convert to another religion or stop believing altogether. I can move away from my family, community, country, and so on, and go and live somewhere else, and so on and so forth. I can change my whereabouts. I can change my situation. I can change myself, and as we will see with Kierkegaard, and that's the question in the existentialist tradition, actually that is my task, to change in the sense of that I also had to make myself. Okay, we will see how Kierkegaard problematizes precisely the idea of the self to begin with in this book, and this is very central to our class, the self, the other, and the world. We will see how, for Kierkegaard, the self is always already divided within itself. It is split, right? I mean, as he will tell us, right, the self is a synthesis. Synthesis, right, is always the coming together, the combination of two, at least two elements, right, two factors. Okay, that's what the self is. So the self is to begin with, and constantly will be, always will be divided, right? I mean, it is the synthesis. Let me know again with questions. If you do, have questions, contact me. But this synthesis, as Kierkegaard will say, there are various ways in which we can look at the synthesis that the self is, right? The coming together of the unity of, if you will, split within itself of these two things, of the finite and infinite. They are opposites, right? Finite means precisely closed, right? Finished, finite, right? And then infinite, which is the negation, in, in not finite, the infinite, is, if you will, the open, the closed, the open, right? And there is this moment of, right, that he says, the infinitizing moment. We constantly, insofar as we stand out, which is to say we exist, right? Because we can also not do so. We can also choose not to do so. I mean, it's still a choice, but, we can, for example, become a number. he will say, in the crowd and not stand out, right? But insofar as we stand out, we constantly go from, the finite into the infinite into the finite. There is always this process of infinitization and then again finitization. What does that mean? It means that when I exit, right, by standing out, and move away and do things, when I exit, when I exist, and therefore exit the situation in which I am to begin with, right, I then step into the open, step into what initially is not finite. This is the infinitizing moment, right? I step into the open, which is also dangerous. That's experience, the danger of experience, because it is there is a degree of like the crossing that we saw right in Nietzsche, the crossing over an abyss where I can also fall, right? I can also, I mean, that's basically stepping into the unknown, right? That's why then it becomes an experience, because I usually draw something that I didn't know before, right? That I learn something from an experience, but it is the unknown, and therefore there is a degree of danger. But it is in this infinitizing process that precisely I leave behind the frame, the box, the square, the situation in which I am uh, to begin with, and I step into something new. However, when I find myself in the new situation, right, that is brought about by, I hope this is clear, this infinitizing moment, this right exit from the finite, then I will find myself in a new situation, right, which is also finite. It will be, if you think about a square, a box, then it will be a greater square, a greater box in which now I find myself, which now is my here and precisely now, my new situation, and then I can, by existing, I can again infinitize myself and finitize myself again and again and again. Okay, so that's the process whereby I make myself, the task of the self is to make itself, as Kierkegaard says. And this is actually probably what I asked you to write about, or no, the journal entry suggestion is another one, but from page 36, right, about despair. We'll talk about despair as well. But I'll point out this important moment when, where Kierkegaard says that the task of the self is to make itself. You can write about that as well, right? This constant, think about this process of individuation. We spoke about individuation, what it is to become, for anything to become the thing that it is, for anything to become this thing, for me to become what I am, the self, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is one way in which you can look at this dialectic, right? You will find the word dialectic, right, and the synthesis, therefore, between precisely the between the finite and the infinite. Then there is also the dialectic between two other terms and others as well, but I touch on this only: possibility and necessity. Necessity and possibility. Necessity would be the same, very similar to the finite, right? Finitude. Necessity, I am of necessity here, right now. I mean, in front of this phone, I'm making, right, this class, right? I mean, by necessity, because everything that I did so far, that I had done today, and so on and so forth in my life, everything has brought me to this point, and I am now necessarily here. I mean, I can change my situation, I can move away, and after I finish recording this, I will do other things as well. But so far, that's a matter of necessity again. However, precisely just like finitude, the finite, there is the possibility of an exit. To use language from other philosophers that we are not studying here, it would be a line of a flight, right? And Therefore, and that's possibility, necessity and possibility, the relationship between, right, and possibility is contingency, the contingency we saw in Leibniz, right, which is the opposite, if you recall, of necessity, right? Necessity is what must be the way it is, right? It is the way it must be, and contingency, possibility is freedom. Whatever we call freedom is precisely, what can be and also not be, right? And that's why, since we are speaking about it, so remember this: the self is always this synthesis, right, between again, right, these two dialectical meaning that you had a unity precisely of two opposite moments, right? And and so you have again the finite and the infinite, right? The passage from the finite into the infinite into the finite, and so on and so forth. And the same then necessity and possibility. Okay, like remember the earlier example I used when I find myself, everybody, when at birth we find ourselves there in that family, that community, that country, and so on and so forth, right? Like I said, that is then something that is, a matter of necessity. I mean, cannot not be that way. It is that way, period, right? Then, however, there is the possibility that we have to change again. Everything or most of, right? So again, possibility and necessity are similar to, right, or necessity and possibility to keep the same, symmetrical, if you will, relation, same to the finite and the infinite, finitude and infinitude. But because I was saying how possibility, and I introduce another important concept, I don't know how much time we have, in right, Kierkegaard, right? I mean, a possibility is the same as contingency, that can be, not be, possibility, but also the possibility not to. I had the possibility to do something, but I also had the possibility not to do it, right? I can also not speak right now. I'm speaking freely, right? No one is forcing me to do so, to speak right now, right? I'm speaking contingently. But every time we had this sense, this freedom, right, contingency, possibility, what is it that really we experience? We experience, right, anxiety. Anxiety is an important word in concept, and despair, is also important. But the anxiety that comes with precisely the openness of the future, right? I mean, the stepping into the open. There cannot not be a degree of anxiety, right? I mean, again, the unknown, right? I mean, fear. There is another book by Kierkegaard that we are not reading per se, but you can find it easily. Short book, great book, and read it. You find it certainly online, which is called Fear and Trembling. Fear and Trembling, which is an account of the very important, wonderful story of Abraham, right, in what in the Christian tradition is then the Old Testament, right? I mean, the one of the books, one of right, the Old Testament in the Bible, right? Old and New Testament. In the Old Testament, the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, the attempted sacrifice. I mean, he's about to kill his own son, right? You know the story, because again, God is asking him to do this sacrifice, and he has a very difficult, to say the least, decision, right? A choice to make, either to obey or disobey God, to kill or not kill his son, and so on and so forth. Whatever he does is terrible. It cannot happen, let alone what, the usual theological, right, and religious explanation of this is, but from the philosophical point of view and the ethical point of view, it cannot, this situation, this experience, terrible experience, cannot come without a degree, right, of a high degree of anxiety and fear. And so, sorry, I mean, the title of the book is Fear and Trembling, right? It's trembling, which is, very important in the context of existentialism, right? I mean, the way in which we are, as we will see next time, Sartre says, we always had to make a choice. We are always, right, we cannot not make a choice. So there is always this trembling when and this fear and anxiety when we do, especially something that then turns out to be important, but at times even things that don't seem to be important, choices and so on, then they have important implications as well. Right. So, in any case, I hope that I, gave you a sense of the general framework here. Okay. Remember the standing out of existence, right? To like ecstatic moment, right? I mean, this uh, coming out of a situation of uniformity and conformity, and indeed the opposite of that would be to conform, as we will see, later as well, to conform, to be the same, to be a number in the crowd. That's the opposite of existence as standing out. And of course, in standing out, there is the danger as well of being noticed, and therefore it is, right, by itself to exist is not an easy thing. It is, a dangerous situation. But in any case, and then keep in mind this dialectical, right, movement and the dialectical synthesis, the coming together, the unity of the opposites of the finite or finitude and the infinite or infinity, and also necessity, right, on the one hand, and possibility slash contingency slash freedom on the other. Okay. I hope this is clear. I want to touch on a few. I mean, this is also difficult, the language at times, especially if you go, for example, to the beginning, right, part one, the sickness unto death is despair. This is on page 9 for you. Despair is another fundamental concept, just like anxiety. Despair is what the sickness unto death, which is not a terminal illness for Kierkegaard, but it is life itself, right? I mean, the sickness unto death, and the despair, precisely this despair will also, come to the fore in different ways, as then he speaks about, for example, the relationship between those two moments that I mentioned before, the finite and the infinite. I mean, to miss, to lack, not to have, to lack infinitude, that's the despair of finitude. And the other way around, I will explain this in a moment, to lack finitude is the despair of infinitude and so on. The same with possibility and necessity, but despair is a common fact in the human condition, as we will see Kierkegaard says, and actually he says that those who believe that they are not in despair are even, who are unaware of being in despair, are even further, deeper down, if you will, into a situation of despair. Okay, so in any case, the beginning, as you see in chapter 1, the despair is the sickness unto death. And then he says, again, look at the highlighted sections, in despair, despair and not being conscious of having a self. Or you have also the other form, despair and not willing to be oneself. Despair and willing to be oneself. Already think about this. I leave that to you, to elaborate on this. Think about this. But it is actually common to hear also, right? People say, this, I mean, the people looking for their own, their true self, right? Or I want to change, for example, myself, right? Again, again, I may not be conscious of having a self. I am perhaps not willing to be myself. I like to be different and so on and so forth. Or I really desperately, for example, want to be myself. What does that mean? And of course, this already tells us how there is and I put it, in a simple, maybe simplistic way, how there is this reality of the fracture, the split, the division that um, Kierkegaard speaks about, how this is evident even in language, the language we use. When I say, I'm proud of myself, I hate myself for something maybe I had done, or, I told even myself, whatever. What is the relationship? Think about that. I leave that to you to think about between this I and this self, right? So the unity, the simplicity of the self that we saw, for example, in Descartes. I think, period. That's this. A think. What am I? A thinking thing for Descartes, right? A thing which thinks, right? A thing which thinks, right? Made entirely, exclusively of a thought, right? I mean, we saw that in Descartes. But now we see that it is more complex than that, certainly, that it is that this reality of, a fractured division is there, right? I and the self, I told myself, whatever, right? There is this um, situation of a relation. That's what Kierkegaard says, and the relation is always between two elements, right? So I, the self, or in any case, the self. Let's see what he says, right? The beginning is, don't worry about it. Might be convoluted, but it is a very beautiful paragraph. Man, right? He starts with this idea. Man is spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self. This is, I'm reading from page 9, right? And but what is the self? The self is a relation. So it's not a simple, right, and unified reality only. It is a relation, right? Which then, he says, relates itself to its own self. There is this kind of reflective moment, right? Think about what this might be. Here you need also to be, you need to interpret this, right, somehow. Or it is that in the relation, that the relation relates itself to its own self. There is this kind of a mirror type of situation, right? And the self is not the relation, but consists in the fact that the relation relates itself to its own self. Man, then he said, a human being, right, is a synthesis. I said that before, a synthesis, right, of, and he says that what I just told you already, the infinite and the finite, of the temporal right now and the eternal, right, timelessness, always the same, of freedom or a possibility, contingency, and necessity, right? In short, it is a synthesis. That's what's important, okay? A synthesis is a relation between two factors, right? That's what I said before. Just like a relation, right? A relation must be between two. A synthesis is a relation between two factors, and so he concludes. So regarded, man is not yet a self. Okay, so remember that there is this task that we had to make our own, whatever we are, our own self. He goes into the question of the relation between two and so on and so forth. We can't, of course, read, again, look at the highlighted sections, but, I want to skip much of this now because we don't have much time and we have to, then you find he speaks about despair as this relationship on page 12, and so on. All is important, right? And again, the relationship comes back, the relationship to himself, right, that one cannot get rid of. That's interesting too. I can't get rid of myself and of this relation. And page 14, you have also the beginning of this section C. Despair is again the sickness unto death. Okay? And read that section as well. I mean, here he mentions also the Christian, understanding. Of course, I didn't say that, but Kierkegaard is, right, also that's important, a Christian philosopher, right? But for him, as he says also, for example, in Fear and Trembling, right, faith is the most difficult thing in the world, right? So he's very critical of people, by the crowd, or what in Nietzsche would be the herd, of people who, too easily believe, right? I mean, the typical right religious person, believer, takes that for granted, that, I believe in, this is my religion, and so on, but it's not easy, right? It's the most difficult thing. And he is certainly very critical of you know the church, as an institution, the way in which, religion is practiced usually, in the sense of conforming to, whatever everybody does, right? But it is always important for each individual, each singularity, let's say, individual, we spoke about the problematic aspect of this concept. Any singularity, right? Any person has to, has the task of, going through this journey, including that of faith, especially that for Kierkegaard, and of finding and making one's own self. Okay, it is not given. I mean, by conforming to the same, to what everybody does, what I get by doing that is precisely the fact that I become, a number in the crowd, right? And I lose my authenticity. I become inauthentic, if you will, and just one of the many, another repetition of the many, as he says. Okay, so in any case, I gave you most of the most important points I touched on already, I believe, and uh, I want to maybe read a few things. So, I mean, he says, for example, on page 16, a despairing man is in despair over something. And there are some wonderful examples there. Also, what does it mean to really despair? For example, if I really there is only one thing that I want and I don't get it, then what am I going to do with myself? Or he gives the example of a relationship, right? When people break, when a relationship ends, and then people can't stand themselves anymore, right? I mean, the sense of failure, what becomes intolerable very often, what I cannot tolerate is, for example, the idea that I have failed in something, and therefore I can't, stand, right, so to speak, myself, right? So that's really a very important moment of despair, right? So the question of finding one's own, if you will, true self, more than finding, it's not that the self is somewhere that we have to look for and find it, but it is a making, right? A constant process of individuation, which we ourselves constantly have the task to make. Let me see if I find that particular uh, section, but then on page 28 also you have something important, the forms of the sickness, i.e., right, that is to say, of despair, and then we get into the question of the synthesis of the finite, the infinite, and uh, the impossibility and necessity. Okay, and this is what I was looking for. I read it for you at the very top of page 29, and you can use that also, to write your journal entry or any your discussion board entry, or you can use any other point, any other of these great, moments in Kierkegaard. or react to the video as well. Think about the meaning of what I said is the meaning of to exist as to stand out. What do you make of it? You can write something about that as well. So, but the first two lines on page 29, right? He says. The self is the conscious synthesis, right, of infinitude and finitude, which relates itself to itself, and then whose task is to become itself. That's very important, right? That's the task that it's kind of it is paradoxical, but that's very important as well. Okay. But and then he continues. I skipped one line, and then he says, "But to become oneself, what is it? Is to become concrete." Think about this. The opposite of concrete is abstract, but concrete is a real situation here and now, and so on. But to become concrete, he continues, right, means I'm reading neither to become finite nor infinite. For that which is to become concrete is a synthesis. Again, and then he goes into, we can read all that together, like you see the section that starts toward the bottom of that page, or at the middle of that page is called, right, section 1, the despair of infinitude is due to the lack of finitude, and then you have the opposite, the despair of finitude later on is due to the lack of infinitude, the same with possibility and necessity, and we can read all that. Read especially the highlighted parts, but all is based on this idea that to become concrete, right? To become oneself is to become concrete. Repeating what I read before, and to become concrete means neither to become finite nor infinite, right? For that which is concrete is a synthesis. Again, it is we need both elements in the relation of a synthesis, right? I mean, to be finite only, in other words, right? To become finite would be to be enclosed in a situation from which there is no exit, right? That I lack, I miss this infinitizing moment, and therefore the possibility of changing the situation of necessity in which I am. That's not good enough. It's like being trapped forever in a situation of captivity forever, right? From which there is no precisely exit, again, line of flight, again, right? However, on the other hand, to become, and you will see this, right? The opposite would be, right? That's the first one, actually, to lack, because that would be to lack infinitude, what I just said, right? I mean, if I have no possibility of exit, if I can't infinitize myself, right? And I am completely caught in a situation of finitude and necessity. But the other way is also, which is actually the first relation that he describes, is as terrible, right? I mean, to lack finitude, right, and to become only, right, infinite, so to speak, right? I mean, is equally as bad, right? Because then I would no longer have any grounding, a ground, right? I hope that I make this clear. I mean, I infinitize myself. If I lose myself into a kind of fantastic world. I mean, imagination, you will see, is very important in Kierkegaard, but imagination also has to be concrete, right? Because otherwise, if it's fantasy, if I build a world of fantasy and I lose myself in this world that doesn't exist, more or less what we also saw in Spinoza, then by losing touch with the finite, I lose touch, as one might say, with reality. And so that is not, of course, a good situation either. One needs both. That's the idea. I mean, and as you will see as you read this, I'm just, in any case, interpreting. This is not necessarily what he says, but that's the essence, the concepts are here, right? I mean, let's say that I go on a journey. That's nice, and then I will, and there is always a degree of danger in doing that as well, in crossing, in traveling, in experiencing things, new things, and so on and so forth. But then I also had to have the possibility to go back home. The finite, the necessity, the grounding, if you will, right? That's home, right? Because otherwise, let's say that I leave and I cannot come back. That's precisely what he says. When I lack finitude, I lose myself in this fantasy world, in this, you know, uh, infinite from which there is no return. Okay? So, in any case, to go back to what I was reading from the beginning of page 29, I hope I made this clear. Let me know. Right? He says, then after he says, for that which is to become concrete is a synthesis, right? He says beautifully, accordingly, he says the development consists in moving away from oneself infinitely by the process, right, of infinitizing oneself, right? Think about this. I hope I made that clear. When I exit, so to speak, the frame, the line of flight, right? I infinitize myself, right? And I move away from myself infinitely when I do that. And he continues, right, in returning to oneself infinitely by the process of finitizing. Okay, so we need both a moving away and also a return, right? Because, like I said before, if I move away and cannot go back, cannot return, and to be sure, you can elaborate on this. Maybe I will never return to exactly the same place, but when I return, let's say from an important trip, an important journey, I am different, right? And that may be also the place where I go back to, so to speak, the situation is different, right? But still, a return of sort must obtain, and so that's again the synthesis of the infinitizing process and the finitizing process. Okay, that's the dialectical movement. Check this word as well, and ask questions if you have any. If, on the contrary, I continue reading, and I can't read the whole, because it's already. So then you do the rest of the reading, right? But if, on the contrary, the self does not become itself, there is this possibility too. It is in despair whether it knows it or not. Right? However, a self, every instant it exists, is in a process of becoming. Right? The self is never complete. Right? Never completely made. Never. The process of becoming myself, the process of individuation, of individuating myself, never ceases, never comes to a stop, to an end. Okay, for he continues, the self potentially, that's beautiful, paradoxical, beautiful, maybe to a degree scary, right? But potentially, the self does not actually exist, right? So it is only that which is that which it is to become. Okay, so the self is always projected forward. It doesn't exist, right? It's a continuous task that we have, a continuous process of becoming and a continuous making of the self, right? Insofar, and this is very important, you can write on this as well. I wrap this up now, right? It's almost 50 minutes. Insofar as the self does not become itself, it is not its own self, but not to be one's own self is despair. Okay, so again, read this relation now. The description, one, the despair of infinitude is to lack infinitude. Sorry, the despair of infinitude is to lack finitude. on page 29, and there are some highlighted moments that you should pay attention to. We can't read all of this together, but I touched on some of these things already as I was introducing, right? The class. Then at the bottom of page 32, you find the opposite type of a dialectical relationship. The despair of a finitude this time is due to the lack of infinitude, like I said before, right? I mean, I need both, right? The moving away into the infinite and the returning, the coming back into the finite, okay? And then again, same idea, you have on page 35, you have the same situation in relation to possibility and necessity, right? And page, the top of, and actually the top of page 36, that's probably where the sentence that I put, that's just a suggestion for you to write on. That's where you find it. A self which has no possibility is in despair, and so in turn the self which has no necessity. I hope that was clear before. Just like I need both the infinite and the finite, I also need right, the necessary and the possible. I mean, I need necessity and the grounding and the home, right? And I need also the possibility to move away, stand out, change my situation, and so on and so forth. But I do need both, okay? So again, the despair, that's the top of page 36, where you had the beginning of this section. The despair of a possibility is due to the lack of a necessity. And again, I can't even read any of these very important moments, but there are many. Some of them I touched on already. And then at the end of page 38, the despair of a necessity is due to the lack of a possibility. Okay, so it is the same idea that we saw earlier, right? And you know. Mm, and then he says on page 42, the top of 42, speaking about personality, and I close there. He says personality is a synthesis of possibility and necessity. Okay, so I hope that this gives you some ideas, some help to do the reading of this difficult book. I mean, I believe that I give you the pages also that you should particularly read, and then again read especially those pay more attention to the highlighted sections. But yeah, the reading is from page 9 to page 27, and then actually 28 to page 85. Okay, all right, so see you next time, and we'll do Sartre. Bye.